Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. I'm Jon Ferro, along with Lisa Abramowicz and Anne-Marie Hordern. Join us each day for insight from the best in markets, economics and geopolitics. From our global headquarters in New York City, we are live on Bloomberg Television weekday mornings from 6 to 9 a.m. Eastern. Subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify or anywhere else you listen. And as always, on the Bloomberg Terminal and the Bloomberg Business app. Dan joins us now for more. Dan, it's good to see you.
Great to be here.
Let's start with that cloud revenue number. So that disappointed, and then we started to hear a little bit more. The contribution from AI is picking up. We're going to see that softness continue in the current quarter, but then re-accelerate. Things start to pick up again in the back half of fiscal 2025. Can you just frame the second piece of this for us? Why do you think that is so much more important than what we're seeing play out this morning?
The words heard around the world, and I think around the street, when Nadella and Amy talked about the acceleration for Azure in the second half, and that AI monetization, that actually starts for real in January. And that's, look, ultimately, you go back to last week, the knee-jerk in terms of the white knuckle moment, Alphabet. Street needed to hear about validation and monetization for AI. They heard it from Nadella on that call. Bullish not just from Microsoft, for the broader tech sector.
Did you find it odd that the stock's down this morning?
Oh, I mean, in my opinion, and we were talking last night, I mean, I think there's stock that goes green in terms of, I can't say today, but
this doesn't stick today?
I'd be shocked if it sticks. Because anyone that heard that conference call, you come out more bullish on Microsoft rather than any sort of skepticism because of the acceleration from Azure, because of monetization, because of commercial bookings, stronger than expected. And that's why, look, these knee-jerk, the haters come out, they've been negative on Microsoft the last 150 points. It all is about the AI revolution, AI monetization, validation.
Why did you turn to Lisa then if you started talking about haters?
He's like the haters over here who have been talking down this story forever, Lisa. Now listen, I don't think it sounded like people were the haters who were actually skeptical of these numbers. They weren't coming out and saying AI is bogus and that everything is wrong and they're going to tank. It was that they weren't surprised dramatically to the upside, and the actual gains that we've seen on the stock imply significant profit gains going forward. Here's one investor. It was really about the cloud services number. It needed to just be a little higher. What do you make of that? Just sort of how people have priced in the forward growth rate and whether they've gotten over their skis in terms of the pace.
No, look, it's a great point. And that's why the most important thing here is show that monetization's coming. Show that you're now going to have growth rates on cloud in the 30%. Would ultimately, if you trajectory it out, an incremental 15, 20 billion for Microsoft. You're not going to see that right away. What basically Nadella and Microsoft showed you, this is coming, and we're going to guide to it. So I think that was the most important thing for the call, despite, in terms of the actual quarter, being strong, but not a wow, pop the champagne quarter.
There's also this issue of who's going to benefit the most as some of the big tech names build out their cloud provisions and build out some of their AI capacities. We both were really struck by AMD overnight, actually seeming to gaining share. Do you think this is a game changer in terms of how much they could compete with NVIDIA?
When Lisa Su talks, everyone listens. And I think this just shows it's not just about the godfather of AI, Jensen and NVIDIA. AMD, they're getting into that AI party. It's 9 p.m. They're getting onto the dance floor. So what you saw from Lisa Su, bullish for AMD, triangulate that with Microsoft, with what I believe we're going to hear from Amazon, Meta, and others. It shows monetization starting, the next phase of AI playing out. That's bullish for ServiceNow, Oracle, Dell, Palantir, Salesforce. Now it's about second, third, fourth derivative playing out. That's why last night everyone's focused on, there's two companies in the world everyone's focused on, Microsoft, NVIDIA. AMD said, hey, don't forget about us. Important call.
NVIDIA up in a pre-market as well off the back of some of this. There was also this story, Danny was talking about it, the story out of Reuters that's lifting Tokyo Electron and ASML. The report that the Biden administration planned to exempt chip equipment makers in Japan, the Netherlands and South Korea from upcoming export restrictions. How important is that story?
Very important, because what's the one thing that could spoil the AI party? It's not Fed, it's not valuation. it's about restrictions. It's about basically like what we see on tariffs and ultimately this U.S.-China cold tech war that's playing out. That was a huge move by the Beltway. Just keeping that tightrope where you want to sound tough and obviously in terms of what's playing out, very significant for ASML. And also it just shows you cannot disrupt the supply chain as all of this constraint, and Microsoft talked about it as well, as playing out.
So we've done the cloud business, we've done the chip makers, we need to finish with your favourite, your baby. We need to talk about Apple. The Mark Gurman report of the last couple of days, you've seen it. The chance that the iPhone is released in September without all the AI goodies. Now, you've had this thesis for a long time. They'd come out with this phone, there'd be this monster upgrade cycle. It's one of the biggest pillars for your bullish call on the Apple stock. Does it change with that report from Mark Gurman?
Not at all. I mean,
not?
Great report by Gurman as always, but developers got it on time. All that matters is developers are going to build hundreds of apps on it. And on iPhone 16, even if it's an update, October, we're talking a few weeks. And I go back to all of our Asia checks. We'll be in Asia again this weekend. It started off as 80 million units for iPhone 16. Guess what it is now based on our checks? 90 million. So the point is, it is not going from 80 to 70, it's going 80 to 90. What that means is Cupertino knows, Cook sees it, where demand's going to be in an AI-driven super cycle.
Do we already have a sense of what some of the AI applications are, consumer-facing, that are going to be sort of game-changing? Because I understand on a sort of corporate sphere, but just getting sort of an emoji that's personalized isn't necessarily a game-changer.
Yeah, of course. And that's why what's so important, a year from now, you're going to have hundreds of apps on this iPhone, on the Apple ecosystem that are AI-driven. That's why developers, that's the hearts and lungs of this story. Apple's given it to them, Apple Intelligence. Now the AI consumer story runs through Cupertino. And it just comes down to later this week, Cook's going to talk about, obviously June I view as almost a background noise to the main event. September, when this gets launched, what I view is really a strong upgrade cycle. Very importantly, China, this will be the last negative quarter. China growth story is back for Apple.
Before we went on air, you were talking about how you've got a lot of events to go to and you didn't really want to show up very casual. What does casual look like for Dan Ives?
So, well, first of all, the biggest insult for a college football fan, or if someone calls you a casual, to me, that is the most insulting you could ever get as a sports fan. If someone says you're a casual. Now, obviously, Ferro being a huge F1 fan, he is along with the Netflix. Epic got me into F1. I will be going to my first F1 race in Vegas, wearing my Ferrari gear.
Well done. You're not a casual. A casual, I would say, is a Red Bull fan. You know, not been involved in a sport very long.
A casual, the biggest insult for any sports fan.
Without a doubt. Dan, it's good to see you.
Great to see you.
Dan Ives of WedBush. I dropped by the green room this morning. Dan was talking to Julian Emmanuel about what was happening in the equity market. Dan said he was this close to dressing in black for this morning's appearance.
Really?
When the Microsoft numbers first dropped. With some real momentum. The latest looks like this, a new Bloomberg and Morning Consult poll showing Kamala Harris closing in on Donald Trump's lead across all 7 swing states. The biggest gains coming in Michigan and Arizona. Henrietta Treyz of Veda Partners writing this. Kamala Harris's entrance into the race has brought the Democratic ticket to highs not seen all year and leveled out the 24 election. Our forecast still anticipates that Donald Trump will win the election with 60% odds to Harris's 40. Henrietta joins us now for more. Henrietta, I want to get into something Lisa and I have been talking about for the last 2 weeks, or at least the last week. This has felt like what we would call in equity markets a position squeeze, that the old CEO has left and the short positions on the Democratic stock have come off. I want to understand if it's more than just that. Are we starting to see some real momentum that could last as we go through Q3 and into Q4?
I think there's a lot of reason to anticipate that this is momentum that has not peaked yet. I'll give you a number of reasons why. First of all, there was an actual election in Arizona last night. We've been tracking it for the last 2 months, but it's a primary election that Kari Lake, the Republican candidate on the Senate ticket against Ruben Galeo, a more progressive Democrat than Kyrsten Sinema, who is retiring this year. Kari Lake is very close to Donald Trump, tours with him regularly, goes to Mar-a-Lago, goes to the White House, etc. and she only got 53, I think, percent of the vote, which means that amongst Republicans, 47% of Republican voters voted against her last night. That is a trajectory shift in a critical swing state that your polls as well laid it on and pointed to hard, confirmable actual elections as opposed to even just polling data, which is the best we can do right now, suggesting that independent voters and moderate voters are trending away from Donald Trump. And that's something that you showed up in swing states across your polling last night, and others did as well, including in Pennsylvania, another critical swing state. Effectively, everywhere that Trump was ahead, he is now declining in, and Harris is on the surge upward.
The opening that you just described in places like Arizona, do you think those kind of developments influence the VP pick in the coming week?
Well, it's my pet belief that Mark Kelly will be the vice presidential candidate. I don't have any special insight there. But to me, you are not going to get a tremendous move from the VP pick in either direction. J.D. Vance may be an example of how we could be wrong there. His negatives have increased pretty substantially. I think he's negative 15 right now. That might be a drag on the ticket, particularly with female voters. But for Mark Kelly, I mean, you really don't need to read too far into it, as my colleague Spencer Perlman likes to say. I mean, they're talking about a naval fighter, an astronaut, gun violence survivor with his wife, Gabby Giffords. It's pretty much a no-brainer. But even voters in Arizona will say that it's not going to move the needle for them. I believe the polling is at 60% of people in Arizona say picking Mark Kelly won't move the needle. I think it's a more broad national approach, specifically on immigration, that leads me to think that Kelly is the candidate that Kamala Harris would choose.
Henrietta, you just gave a lot of reasons for why this kind of has been a changed race. Why do you see the outcome being the same?
Because I don't have enough data yet. It's really very fresh. The Bloomberg-Morning Consult data is the best and the latest and the only data that we have across all swing states since Kamala Harris joined the ticket. So it's going to take a lot more of that to convince me. And as my clients know, I have a very aggressive incumbency bias. For our purposes now, I believe that the incumbent in this race is Donald Trump. And I need to see the Democratic candidate, particularly in the Electoral College, pull ahead 2 to 4 points in all of those states consistently in order for me to change any of the races. So I'm looking very closely at Nevada, at Georgia, obviously at Pennsylvania, but I think Arizona is moving in the direction that Kamala Harris wants to see. Donald Trump's best lock is on Pennsylvania and North Carolina right now.
John, I love that Donald Trump is the incumbent, and basically Kamala Harris is not being considered as Joe Biden's kind of surrogate in any kind of way.
What do you make of that? Because I remember when Joe Biden stepped down, we did a special in the evening, and the first question we all asked about Kamala Harris is how much distance she could put between herself and Joe Biden.
Well, that's exactly the question, Henrietta. I mean, how much distance is there? Isn't it fair to say that she's essentially the incumbent policy president, or does she really represent an independent voice from Joe Biden?
Yeah, no, she's definitely a different candidate, and I would love if this race were about policy, but we haven't gotten there yet. I mean, whenever we get to tax policy, I'll be thrilled. But at this point, it's really the change is in Democratic activation, specifically with double-digit gains for the Democratic ticket. Plus 25 with black voters, plus 24 with Latino voters, huge gains with female voters, double-digit gains with youth voters. It's a new ticket, and she's not the incumbent because it's brought a brand new basket of voters to the field. There was a slight uptick in Democratic voter registration in North Carolina in the last week, for example. So it's not that there is a policy shift. It's that this is a fresh face for the ticket. You can see it in her approval ratings, which have changed faster than any candidate I've ever seen.
You know the most ridiculous thing about all of this, Henrietta? This was the objective all along, to have the early debate, to engage the population, to drum up the enthusiasm, to get people engaged early. This is just not how we thought things would turn out. It was the objective of the Democratic ticket, of course, but we thought on the ticket at the top would be Joe Biden. And of course, Lisa, the debate went in a different direction, and ultimately the outcome's been the same, but with a different name on the ticket. It's amazing, isn't it?
And we're talking instead not about policy. In fact, that's kind of lost the stage. We're instead talking about weird and getting fired up. And
Henrietta, can I jump in just quickly? When will we talk about policy? We've seen a massive change in this election race, and Kamala Harris has gone on some scripted rallies, which I get it, drumming up loads of enthusiasm, but when do we start to hear about actual policy?
Never. I imagine it won't get around to that. I mean, at the best case, we could say after Labor Day, when people come back from vacation, we'll start to tune in. But the immigration and maybe fentanyl are areas where I think Trump has a really good chance of slamming Kamala Harris and taking away some of her early and hopefully for him not locked in gains. But I don't see a race between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump talking about, capital gains tax rates or corporate tax rate. I really just don't see that happening. I think it's more about the top of the message. The gender divide is probably the biggest indicator of that. The largest divide in the electorate right now is between men and women.
Interesting. Henrietta, thank you. Henrietta Treyz there of Veda Partners. Let's talk to a man who's been in the actual room making the decision many times before over the years. Joining us now is Jim Bullard, the Dean of the Mitchell E. Daniels Jr. School of Business at Purdue University and the former St. Louis Fed President. Jim, it's wonderful to catch up with you, sir. Once again, a timely conversation. You have lived this repeatedly and you've experienced the calls coming from outside the building, beyond the FOMC, to do something. And we've heard plenty of those calls. You've seen them too. From the likes of Alan Blinder, from the likes of Bill Dudley, from Mohamed Al-Arian saying this Federal Reserve needs to get a move on. I want to pick up on the last one. Mohamed Al-Arian, the point that he's made is a similar one that you've made, Jim, is that this Federal Reserve seems to have become more data point dependent and not data dependent. Can you just explain the distinction and the importance between the two?
Yeah, I think if you say you're waiting to the next meeting because you want to see some data between now and the next meeting, that makes markets wonder, okay, well, what is it that could derail a rate cut between now and the next meeting? If you do react to that data, then that's kind of data point dependence. And I think that's what Mohamed Al-Arian has been talking about. One thing that I did often say when I was on the committee was that, if you know you're going to do something with 100% probability at the next meeting, why aren't you doing it at this meeting? And I think that often gets the committee into a little bit of hot water because sometimes the data don't cooperate between this meeting and the next meeting. So it can be managed, but it's kind of a committee dynamic that's been on and off over the last decade or more.
This is the reason why many people, including Mohamed Al-Arian, say the Fed probably is not going to cut rates today by 25 basis points, even if there is a consensus that they're going to in September because they haven't telegraphed it and it would disrupt markets, saying what do they now think that they didn't think at the last meeting. However, Liz Young, we were also talking to James Camp of Eagle Asset Management. They're suggesting the Fed could set up a 50 basis point rate cut in September. Are you sympathetic with that?
No, I think that's too much. What I do think could happen is that they'll get going in September, but the discussion will turn to what about November? What about December? What will the pace be? Chair Powell said that this first rate cut is consequential because it starts a process. What is that process? And if the data continue to confirm disinflationary trends, I think you could bring November onto the table, and then you could have a sequence of rate cuts into the first part of next year, and then the committee could assess at that point where they are and how they want to play it from that point.
Do you feel like they've backed themselves into a corner in some ways by being so data dependent, by just repeating that sort of de facto to every question?
I don't know. This is a pretty successful policy here. Output growing, between 2 and 2.5% on a run rate. That's very close to the potential growth rate for the U.S. economy. Unemployment coming up ever so slightly as they predicted. Inflation coming down as they predicted. There's a lot to like about this. And the last piece of the soft landing would be to get the short end of the curve down and get rid of the inversion of the yield curve. So to do that in an organized way without signaling that you're worried about the economy, because I don't think they are worried about the economy right now, is really the trick here.
Jim, do you think they should be worried about the economy right now?
I think it's still, to me, it looks like an economy that's in a soft landing. It's growing at a trend pace, pretty good. Of course, there's always risks out there. There's always the possibility that some big shock would occur, or one of the geopolitical events would sort of roll back onto the global macroeconomy. But just sitting here with this data, this looks awfully good. And so if they can get the last piece of the puzzle in place, I think they'll be in great shape.
I said earlier this morning that the Federal Reserve is not in the crystal ball business, it's in the risk management business. And Jim, you know that better than most. And I just wonder, when you think about the balance of risk right now, if the risk for higher unemployment is greater than the risk for higher inflation, do they need to formalize that somehow in the statement that comes out a little bit later on this afternoon?
Yeah, I would say they probably think it's more balanced than it was. You had this overheated labor market, which is now much closer to the pre-pandemic labor market, but that labor market was considered pretty strong. And now you've got inflation not being nearly the, still elevated, moderately elevated, but not nearly the concern that it would have been a year ago, or 15 or 16 months ago, when it was up closer to 5% on the preferred measures of the committee. So I think things are relatively balanced. Now they can begin to lower the policy rate. There is a risk, though, that when output's growing a trend and unemployment's at the right level and everything's going good, well, the policy rate should be at its neutral level as well. And that's the part of the soft landing that isn't there. So the comments by Alan Blinder and Mohamed El-Arian and Bill Dudley are reflecting that, I think, is that they couldn't find a moment earlier this year to get started on this downward descent. And they're hoping that September will be that moment.
The problem with going back to neutral is that there is a huge debate raging in markets, and I'm sure at the Fed as well, on what neutral looks like, on whether we truly are in a higher inflation type of regime or whether we're going back to something familiar to pre-pandemic. It seems like about 6 months ago, everyone was saying we're in a new higher inflation regime, and increasingly it just seems like there's some doubt entering in that maybe we're reverting back to what we knew, say, 5-6 years ago. Where are you in this?
On that, I would say that the committee should guard against inflation dipping below the inflation target, because I think if that happens, then you will get this discussion about, okay, we're going back to the regime that was in place between 2009 and 2019, exceptionally low inflation, exceptionally low nominal interest rates, even negative nominal interest rates in many parts of the world. They'd be worried about that. So I don't think you want to do that. You want to approach the inflation target asymptotically from above. We're at about 2.5% inflation right now, PCE. You'd like that to gently come down to 2%. Even when they lower the policy rate, it'll still be a restrictive policy. They'll still be putting downward pressure on inflation, but you don't want to put too much pressure on now because you want to glide path into the 2% target.
Based on what you just said, you earlier said that the balance of risks is basically pretty equally balanced, measured at a time where inflation is coming down but still present and employment still looks like it's fairly strong. Based on the fact that you think that there is a greater risk of inflation undershooting than overshooting, that is the bigger risk that the Fed needs to counter, what would be the argument for them not to say that the balance of risks?
So far, it's a risk that hasn't even been talked about. But now it's time to start thinking about that as you try to get this last leg of the soft landing in place. And so, when you're coming off 5% core PCE inflation, you're kind of, it's traumatizing for a central banker. So right now they've just been focused on let's make sure inflation is not going back up, and that was the story certainly in the first quarter of this year. But now that you've got better inflation reports, now you have to think about, how do we play the end game here, declare victory, get into the soft landing, and then see what's around the corner.
So why wouldn't they just put an emphasis on the employment market and say that there are clear signs that it's softening, there are clear signs that it's normalizing, and we aren't sure where it's heading. Right now, we're going to focus more on that than inflation.
I think they've been gently saying that. But really, the labor market has been normalizing from a very hot market. You had 2 job openings for every unemployed worker, just astoundingly high. Now you still have 1.2 openings per unemployed worker or so. That's the pre-pandemic number. That was also a good labor market. So it's not that the labor market is deteriorating in a way that causes alarm or would cause the committee to move. But you have to ask if, and Austin Goolsbee of the Chicago Fed has asked, if you thought 5 3/8 was the right policy rate last summer when inflation was much higher, why do you think 5 3/8 is the same? Is also the right policy rate today with a little bit higher unemployment and much lower inflation. So you do have to react to the data in the big picture, and I think that's the committee's looking for the right way to do that and the right moment to do that, and it looks like September is going to be that moment.
Hey Jim, boiler up. Am I doing it right? I think I'm doing it right. Former St. Louis Fed President Jim Bullard out of Purdue now. Appreciate it, sir. Thank you very much.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast, bringing you the best in markets, economics and geopolitics. You can watch the show live on Bloomberg TV weekday mornings from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. Eastern. Subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify or anywhere else you listen. And as always, on the Bloomberg Terminal and the Bloomberg Business app.